Okay, so thank you and good morning, everybody. Um, my purpose here with this presentation is to discuss a couple of details about the role of the sea as a threshold in J.R.R. Tolkien's Legendarium. But first of all, why should we bother with this idea? My question that motivates this research is um, how did Tolkien use the references he got from the previous readings that he could access during his scholar period, and how is the sea involved in those works? I will present some examples of these readings, and a second idea would be, after Tolkien's death in 1973, how do these ideas or these representations of the sea have prevailed in later adaptations of his Legendarium? These are more or less the contents that I'm going to cover at this presentation. First of all, I will discuss a couple of methodological aspects of the literary methodology I'll be using for this presentation, especially about the sea and symbols in general, and specifically the role of the threshold. That is very interesting. Second place, we presenting some elements about Tolkien's life, some anecdotes about his life where sea was involved in some way. Just after that, I would present some examples, some representative examples of readings that he had access to, where the sea is also very present. Next, I will introduce you to Tolkien's works, covering some examples of the sea as a threshold in these works. And finally, I would make short comments about later adaptations of his Legendarium. And of course, I will finish with some conclusions. Okay, so first of all, I need to specify that the literary approach that I'm using for the presentation is eco-criticism. For those of you who are not familiar with this concept, eco-criticism is the literary approach that explores the relationships between literature and the environment. Charles Bluffelty, for example, is one of the most relevant scholars that has developed this approach. And the methodology I'll be using for this analysis is the one from eco-criticism. And second place, some details about the sea, because as eco-criticism explores the role of natural elements, not only the sea, that is the one that I'm focusing on, but also forests, mountains, etc., are an object of research. In this case, the sea has been already analyzed by lots of authors, such as, for example, Susana Fidalgo, who has concluded that the sea can be identified as the dwelling of the beasts. He uses some examples such as the representations of the sea in Beowulf, which is a very famous poem. In second place, we have, for example, a research carried out by Gabriela Silva Rivero. It was titled Water, Melancholy and Healing in the Lord of the Rings. In this case, she provides a more positive interpretation of the sea. She specifies that the sea can be identified as a promise of healing and an opportunity of reflection. So in this case, we have an idea of the sea as a place where some characters or people can find peace and recovery after some certain events. And apart from these two pieces of research, I've also wanted to include some references to dictionaries of symbols, which are a very good reference to find interpretations of symbols. For example, here I have provided a reference from Jean Chevalier, Dictionary of Symbols, and he also continues with this idea of the sea with some kind of duality. We have at the same time an image of life and death, as you can see there. The sea can be a source of purification and regeneration. During the following examples that we'll cover in this presentation, you will see that the sea has both sides. We can find life and death, we can find peace and danger, for example, as well. It's going to be a continuous reference. And finally, about the threshold, which is the second important symbol I'm going to cover here. The threshold is a symbol that is very frequently associated with the sea. In a second reference of a dictionary of symbols, which is the one by Juan Eduardo Quirlot, we find the reference to the threshold as a symbol of transition or transcendence. The threshold, as you may already know, makes a difference between two sides or establishes a barrier between two sides. And again, finding references in Chevalier's dictionary, we found that it symbolizes at once the separation and possibility of an alliance. So just like the sea, which has this kind of duality between life and death or peace and danger and all those, we find that the threshold also provides this duality between separating things or gathering things. Okay, in a second place, I would like to comment some events or anecdotes from Tolkien's life, because the sea was also present in Tolkien's life during many moments from his very childhood. When he was only 4 years old, he had to face a trip, a very long trip from South Africa to England, and during that journey, he would also, always had lots of memories from the different landscape he visited. Some years later, when he grew up, he would enjoy going to the region of Cornwall on holidays, and that place was also very interesting for him. He would enjoy making lots of sketches about the landscape there. Cornwall, if you're already familiar with it, has lots of cliffs, beaches, and coastal landscapes that are very, very beautiful. And for sure, he got some references from there. Again, some years later, when World War I started, he also had to face a trip from England to France, crossing the English Channel on a boat. And there are testimonies that prove that for him this trip was very uncomfortable and very hard, because, if I'm not mistaken, he lost his personal items. It was a disaster for him, this trip, because he didn't enjoy it. And apart from this, although this final detail doesn't have to do with Tolkien's life directly, but it belongs to the chronological period where he lived on, so it is worth mentioning that his life was at the same time as the period of polar explorers and big sea voyages. For example, we have the expedition of Shackleton, the expedition of Roald Amundsen, or even a more famous one, the disaster of the Titanic, happened during his life. So these were all stories that inspired him somehow. Okay, now moving on to the period of, to the chapter of the readings that he had access to during his scholar period, we have some representative examples, because it would be very difficult to cover all the different sources of influences that he received. But I have chosen 2 Icelandic sagas, which were a genre that he was very familiar with. The 2 sagas that I have chosen are the saga of Eric the Red, one of the very famous Viking explorers who reached Greenland, and he had a saga about himself. In this case, the story that is told about this character tells a story about a crew and a group of explorers that faced lots of hardships on the sea, and many of them couldn't survive this trip. Some of them were not brave enough or couldn't resist the traveling conditions, and many of them died during this trip. So in this case, we could identify the sea as, again, a threshold or a barrier that not everyone can be able to cross. So it is like a test for these characters to prove who is worth of crossing this threshold. In the second place, we have another saga, which is the saga of Thorstein, another character who has to face lots of dangers and threats from other characters. For example, I have included a passage from a trip that Thorstein is making in this saga, and he's attacked, but not directly attacked, because some characters decide to use magic. For example, we have Jokul and Ogautan, who are 2 Vikings that decide to attack him, but through magic. It is Ogautan who has a skin bag in his belt, and by shaking this bag, he is able to manipulate the sea and create storms that they used to attack Thorstein, and of course killing most of his crew again. In this case, the interpretation of the sea as a threshold is that of a threshold that separates or divides the characters in this saga between the righteous or the good ones from the ones that are evil and decide to manipulate nature for evil purposes. And as we can see in this saga, the characters that decide to manipulate the sea with evil purposes are later punished because they are killed through the same means that they have used to kill the righteous characters. Moving on to the next example, we have an old English poem, which is The Seafarer. If you're not familiar with this poem, it is about a man who has spent most of his life in the sea, but at the last stages of his life, he has been pulled apart from the sea. He's not able to live by the sea anymore. So his feelings, and as it is explained in the poem, are the feelings of an outcast. He's not able to live properly anymore. His soul, as you can see in those passages, roams with the sea. So again, in this case, the threshold of the sea is one that he has been pulled apart. He's not able to cross that threshold. And finally, a very significant example of influences for Tolkien in early readings at his scholar period is, of course, undeniably the Holy Bible. The Holy Bible has lots of passages where the sea is present and where the sea acts as a threshold again, but I have considered that maybe the most relevant one is the story of Moses carrying the people of Israel to cross the Red Sea. And in this case, the sea doesn't only act as a metaphorical threshold, but directly as a physical threshold. If you are not familiar with the story, Moses puts his hand in the shore of the Red Sea, and he directly is able to divide the sea in two, creating a safe passage for his people. And he and his people are able to cross this threshold, but later the sea goes back to its original situation and stops the people of Egypt. Okay, so now moving on to Tolkien's own works, we can see how these previous examples have transformed or have been preserved in Tolkien's works. I have selected some moments from the Silmarillion and also from the Lord of the Rings. I will show them in the next slide. Concerning the Silmarillion, it would be impossible to forget about Ulmo and Uinen, who are two of the most relevant characters bound to the sea. They could even be understood as the guardians of the threshold, the sea as a threshold, and they are the guardians because we have Ulmo, who is always finding what happens in the rest of the world, in Middle-earth and many different territories, through the sea. The sea carries news for him. And Uinen, at the same time, has a very specific chapter where he shows her grief about the King Selene of Alqualonde, and when she starts to cry, the sea enrages and kills many Noldor who are trying to reach Middle-earth. Apart from these two characters, we have whole races such as the Númenóreans, who are often identified as the supreme mariners. They are identified as a people who are also bound to the sea. They develop a deep love for the sea, but the idea of the threshold concerning the Númenóreans happens when they are corrupted by Sauron, and they change this feeling from love to a desire for conquering the sea. They have been told not to sail to the west because the Valar decided this, but they decide to break this prohibition and try to conquer the sea and even the Undying Lands. And just like Jokul and Ogautan in the Saga of Thorstein, they finally pay the price, finding destruction of them and their own land. Another race is the Teleri, who are also a race of elves that also develop a deep love for the sea, but they don't find the sea in the first place when they are born, when they awaken in Cuivienen. They are later guided to the sea, and they are able to cross the Belegar and finally reach the Undying Land. So we can understand that they have been allowed to cross this threshold. And some other certain characters are Galadriel, who, as I said before, was present during the chapter of the Kingslaying of Alqualonde, but he was not allowed to sail with the rest of her kin, sorry, and instead of crossing the sea, she has to go north and go through a frozen steppe, the Helcarax, which is a very hard experience as well. And to finish with this part, we have the story of Arendil, who is also a very famous mariner. He is entrusted with one of the Silmarils, and after all the famous battles and events he has overcome, he transcends and continues with his voyage from the sea to the skies. So finally, his place is in the sky, carrying the Silmaril. And a couple of examples as well from the Lord of the Rings. These are going to be much briefer. We also have the race of the elves in the Lord of the Rings, but in this case, their feeling towards Middle Earth is much sadder, and they need to abandon Middle Earth, so they have to cross the threshold of the sea again because they need to find peace in the Undying Land. So in this case, they are crossing the threshold towards salvation. And also, one of the most important characters in the Lord of the Rings are Bilbo and Frodo, the two hobbits who carry the ring. Well, Bilbo carried the ring during The Hobbit, but Frodo finally carries the ring during the Lord of the Rings. And at the final chapters of the story, they are allowed to, again, cross the sea to the Undying Lands as a reward, because they have carried the burden of the ring, and they deserve this prize. And another example in the Lord of the Rings, the events in the Lord of the Rings, is the story of the Mirror of Galadriel, because Frodo looks at the mirror and has a vision of the sea enraged in the middle of a storm. But when we finish reading the Lord of the Rings, we find that when Frodo finally crosses the sea and sails to the Undying Lands, he has a new vision, but in this case, the portrayal of the sea is much more relaxed. He finds the sea in a more righteous way, let's say. It seems that some of the pictures have disappeared, but concerning the later adaptations of Tolkien's Legendarium in modern media, I'm just going to make two short comments on the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy, because the two examples that I just mentioned from the Lord of the Rings have been very well preserved, because the elves' departure is portrayed in the same way. The explanations that are given in the movie are more or less the same, and the final scene where Frodo and Bilbo live in the ship are also maintained. So in this case, the references are more or less the same. We see that the symbols of the sea as a threshold have been preserved. And more or less to finish, I would like to make a couple of comments on the very recent TV series of The Rings of Power, because in this case, some of the symbols of the sea as a threshold have been preserved, and some of them have been provided with new meanings. In this case, the story of Galadriel has been interpreted in a slightly different way, because the story in the series presents us with a Galadriel that is completely focused on facing Sauron and fighting Sauron, but she is convinced to sail to the Undying Lands and be released of this burden. But it's a pity that the picture is not here, but she decides not to finally reach the Undying Lands, and in the middle of the voyage, he throws herself to the sea. If you have watched the series, you may remember this. So she decides not to cross the threshold. In the case of Númenor, we also find that the sea is very present in their culture, and we can understand that in the series they use the sea as a threshold, but that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, separates or tests the new mariners. So it is a threshold that is used to distinguish the brave mariners for the ones that are not worth to belong to the sailors. And the final example I would like to present you is the final scene. I think it's in the last chapter, where Sauron gets into Galadriel's mind, and he talks to her as if they were back in the raft. It is a scene that has happened almost at the beginning of the series, but they go back to the raft in the middle of the sea, and I think it is better to show you directly the scene, and we would discuss it later. Let's see if the sound is on.
I could be free of it
You
now.
deceived me.
I told you the truth. I told you that I had done evil, and you did not care. Because you knew that our past meant nothing. Weighed against our future.
There is no such future.
Isn't there? All others look on you with doubt. I alone can see your greatness.
Okay, so it was just this brief scene. As you can see, in this case, as I said before, the series has provided us with new interpretations of the sea as a threshold. In this case, I would dare to interpret this as a representation of the sea between as a threshold between reality and a possible future, or as reality and illusions. So this is again a new possible interpretation that the series has provided as well.
I could...
And finally, I would like to finish with two very little conclusions. That is that we could easily understand that the sea as a threshold has been a symbol that has been preserved from the works that Tolkien read to the ones that he wrote by himself, and the later adaptations that we have nowadays. And also, a second idea that we like to mention is that it doesn't matter that we have changed from a format in literature to audiovisual material, that we can still find the same symbols and the same interpretations despite we have changed the format. And with that, I would like to finish, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you both for your presentations. And my question is for Diego. I simply loved your presentation on the sea and as a threshold to somewhere else in Tolkien. And I was it's a comment because I thought about the sea as well, and I've been thinking of this legend in the Middle Ages, the Navigatio, from Saint Brendan, and his navigation, and that takes place in the context of Irish monks, and how it presents the sea as a multi-layered space. So it's not just a threshold, but a multi-layered space that allows for transformation, has a spiritual, weighty element. So I think it's worth. I don't know if you've already considered, and you have comments on that. But if not, I'm just stopping it there because I think it's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the truth is that I'm not familiar yet with that story, but if I have understood well, it provides us with a wider concept of the sea, with different layers. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's part of the Celtic understanding of natural landscapes, and which on the one surface there is the physical space of a forest or of the sea, but then as characters or protagonists go into, they discover another layer, and usually there is a fantastic element. So and it abounds with abounds. There are a few important tales or stories relating to the sea. And I think the most important one is this one, St. Brendan and his navigation. And then there are a few others, and the names, I'm very bad with titles, so I don't remember the titles. But there is this one that they also go into the sea, and as they're sailing, they look, as we saw in the video, and they look at the surface of the waters, and they see another world that it's living under the waters. So I think it's definitely, I think it provides material. I'll be very happy to discuss this later if
Perhaps the writers of the series were familiar were familiar with this story, and maybe they took it from there.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Thank you so much for the reference. I have a look at it.
Thank you.